I was still holding my own birthday plate when my father raised his glass and thanked everyone for supporting the real family. The room went quiet in that soft, careful way people use when they are not sure if something was a joke. A few smiles stayed frozen. Someone laughed under their breath. My mother did not look at me. My sister kept her eyes on her drink. I waited for him to correct it, to say my name, to notice I was standing right there. He didn't. No one did, and somehow that silence said everything I needed to hear. No one spoke to me after that, not right away. The room simply moved on like nothing had shifted. Conversations picked back up in small pockets. Glasses touched again. Someone asked about the food. It all continued smooth and quiet, as if I had already stepped out of the frame. I stayed where I was for a moment, still holding the plate, still waiting for something that didn't come. My father didn't look in my direction. Again, he kept talking, smiling, moving between people like a man hosting something important, like a man who had just said exactly what he meant to say. He set the plate down on the nearest table. My hands felt steady, which surprised me. I thought they would shake. I thought something inside me would break loudly enough for someone to notice. But nothing did. It was quiet, almost calm. My mother passed by me not long after, carrying a tray of drinks. She slowed just enough to meet my eyes for a second, then looked away like she had forgotten what she was about to say. Her smile stayed in place, practiced and polite. It didn't reach her eyes. You should go sit, she said softly, not stopping. Don't make it obvious. That was all. Not a correction, not a question, just a quiet instruction, like I was the one at risk of causing a scene. I nodded without thinking, even though she had already moved on. That was the part that stayed with me longer than anything my father said. Not the words, but the ease of it, the way she chose silence so quickly, so naturally. Found a chair near the back of the room, slightly out of the main circle. No one told me to move. No one asked if I was okay. A few people glanced at me, then away again, like they weren't sure what role I played anymore. From where I sat, I could see my father clearly. He was telling a story now, something about how much work had gone into bringing everyone together. People nodded. Someone complimented him. He laughed the same way he always did when he was being admired. Had heard that tone my whole life. There was a time when I thought it meant something else, when I thought if I worked hard enough, if I stayed quiet enough, if I did everything right, I would be included. In moments like this, not just physically but fully recognized. Zeddy watched him gesture toward my sister at one point, his voice warm, proud. He mentioned her by name, said she had done so much, that she understood the family better than anyone. No one corrected him than I. There it would have been easy to interrupt, easy for someone to say my name out loud just once to balance the room, but no one did, and I understood why. Even then it wasn't confusion, it was agreement. My sister finally looked at me once briefly from across the room. There was some ethanginardal in her expression, not guilt, not surprise, just awareness, like she knew exactly what had happened and had already accepted it. She didn't look away quickly, she just returned to her conversation. As if that single glance was enough. He stayed in that chair longer than I planned to, long enough to notice how natural it all became. My absence, even while I was still there, the way people adjusted without needing to say anything out loud. At some point, one of the guests came over and asked if I was enjoying the evening. I smiled and said yes. The word came out easily, too easily. She nodded, satisfied, and moved on. That was when it settled fully, not as a sharp feeling, but as something quieter and heavier. No one here was confused about who I was. They just weren't going to say out loud. It would have been easier to believe that night was an exception, a single misstep, a strange isolated moment where something simply went wrong. Standing there, watching everything unfold with quiet precision, I knew it wasn't new. It just hadn't been this visible before. With truths I had always been slightly outside of things, not excluded in ways people could easily point to, but in smaller, quieter patterns. I was the one who adjusted plans, who filled gaps, who stayed late to help clean, while everyone else drifted toward comfort. When something went wrong, I was the easiest place to put it, not directly blamed, just gently redirected toward responsibility. Was subtle enough that I questioned myself more than I questioned them. Growing up, I learned to read the room before speaking. I learned which moments belonged to me and which didn't. Celebrations, decisions, even simple conversations seemed to orbit around others more naturally. I told myself It was just personality, just dynamics, that not everyone needed to be at the center. But there's a difference between not needing attention and never being acknowledged. Ali started remembering things I had ignored at the time my work was presented as a group effort, even though I had carried it alone. The way my ideas were repeated by someone else and suddenly taken seriously. The small pauses when I entered a room, like something had to be adjusted to make space for me, even in places I should have already belonged and known. If it was loud, none of it was dramatic. That's what made it so easy to dismiss. Bit patterns don't need volume to be real. The evening, I watched my sister move easily between conversations, her presence expected, welcomed. When she spoke, people listened. When she laughed, others followed. It wasn't forced, it was natural, like she had always been meant to exist at the center of things. And maybe Shihadi didn't resent her. Not really, she was simply playing a role the rest of them had agreed on long before I understood there were roles to begin with. What unsettled me wasn't her place, it was mine. A thought about how often I had stepped back without being asked. How many times I had softened my own voice so someone else could be heard more clearly. It hadn't felt like sacrifice at the time, it felt like cooperation, like being part of something larger than myself. But standing there, it became clear that what I called cooperation had slowly turned into erasure. Not sudden, not cruel in an obvious way, just consistent. And consistency changes things. He remembered birthdays where I organized everything but wasn't mentioned, family decisions where I was informed, not consulted, moments where I waited for acknowledgement that never came. Then convinced myself it wasn't necessary. It wasn't that they pushed me out, it was that they never pulled me in. The difference matters more than people think, because when you're not actively included, you start doing the work yourself. You try harder, you become more useful, more agreeable, more careful. You shape yourself into something that fits, even if it means losing the parts that don't. And the worst part is it almost works. Almost. That night wasn't the beginning of anything, it was the point where everything aligned clearly enough that I couldn't look away anymore. I wasn't overlooked by accident, I was overlooked because it was easier for them to keep things as they were, easier to let me remain in the background where I didn't disrupt the balance they were comfortable with. No one had to say out loud, no one had to agree to it. For melody just lived. I had been living it too, without fully understanding what it was costing. Mess. Standing there, I realized something that felt both heavy and strangely calm. Me had spent years trying to earn a place that was never being offered. The moment it finally crossed a line wasn't loud, it didn't come with raised voices or obvious confrontation. It happened the same way everything else had, quietly, in a way that could almost be explained away if I wanted to ignore it. But this time I didn't. A week after the gathering, my father called me into his office. It wasn't unusual. He often spoke in a calm, measured tone, the kind that made everything sound reasonable before you had time to question it. Papers were already laid out on the desk when I walked in, neatly arranged, prepared. He didn't look nervous, he looked certain. He explained, it is a formality, something practical, a restructuring. He called it the business, the house, the long-term planning for the family. Words that sounded responsible, almost thoughtful. If I hadn't been paying attention, I might have accepted them at face value, but I had started paying attention. He slid the papers slightly closer to me, not directly offering them, just placing them within reach. That small distance felt intentional, like the choice still belonged to me, even though it didn't. Read enough to understand me. Name was there, but not in the way it should have been, not as an equal, not even as a participant. It was positioned in a way that removed more than it gave. Rights transferred, access limited, decisions redirected elsewhere, mostly to my sister. Didn't react immediately. That was the part of myself I had perfected over time, the ability to stay still while something important shifted underneath me. He kept talking, explaining benefits, long-term clarity, how this would simplify things for everyone. That word landed heavier than the rest because for once it didn't include me. Asked a few questions, calm ones, specific. He answered them without hesitation, as if he had already prepared for this exact conversation. There was no room left for confusion, only acceptance or refusal. And refusal wasn't something I had practiced before. For years, I had adjusted, I had agreed I had trusted that staying patient, staying cooperative, would eventually lead to something. Balance, something fair, but sitting there looking at those papers, I understood something with a clarity I hadn't allowed myself before. This wasn't a misunderstanding, was a decision. A decision made without me, presented to me as if I were still part